So let's kick off, and a very warm welcome from us all to this session on leading with imposter syndrome. I'm Russell Borland, and with my colleagues Thomas Chalmers and Jane Welsh, we're going to facilitate this session with you this morning on what is a really popular subject of imposter syndrome. Now, the session is going to run until 9:20, so it's a 50-minute webinar. And we have a great panelist who I'll introduce shortly, who are going to bring the topic to life. Now, the reason we're here is that at a previous session that we held in June, we were talking with leaders about their journey in developing as leaders. And you can see here in the graphic, below are the various building blocks that we have found through our discussions and our research and talking with many leaders. And then above the line are the various people that have quite often influenced leaders in their development. And it's when we were talking about the emotional development that one of the panelists in June said that sometimes they feel that in their role, they're not always as confident as they could be. And that then started a conversation about imposter syndrome. In fact, all the panelists then conceded that they felt as though they suffered to some extent from imposter syndrome. So it led to such a great deal of interest that we decided to run a session on the subject alone. And so far we have well over 130 people have registered. So it is a very topical issue and one that affects many people. So to bring the discussion to life, as I say, we have a great panel with us this morning. I'll just introduce them very quickly. We have Marjorie and Ngwenya, who's an executive coach, non-executive director, and an author. Marjorie is also a qualified actuary and was indeed relatively recently president of the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. Alongside Marjorie, we have Luba Nikulina, who is Global Head of Research at Willis Towers Watson, and apparently at some point in her past also owned a timber business. So that may come out in the discussions. And finally, we have David Piltz, who is, like Marjorie, also an actuary, and he is UK Managing Director of Buck Consulting, who are a global firm of pensions and benefits consultants and HR services as well. So welcome to you all. Before I pass over to Thomas, just a few bits of housekeeping. As I say, the session will finish at 9:20. The session is going to be recorded, so if you miss any part of it or want to refer back to it, there will be a recording available on the website. And thirdly, I'll have to refer to my notes to remind myself, yes, there's a chat function at the bottom of your screen on the control panel. And through that, you can ask questions of the panel. And Jane is going to be monitoring them and liaising with Thomas about those questions. And Jane's also going to be closing the session towards the end. So many thanks to everybody for joining, panelists and those who've just been joining recently. And I'll just pass over to Thomas.
Well, thank you, Russell, and a very good morning, everyone. As many of you will know who have logged in this morning, imposter syndrome is really a psychological pattern or phenomenon where successful individuals are really unable to internalize their accomplishments. Now, They often feel inadequate, doubting their accomplishments and their talents, putting their success down to luck, and are constantly fearful of being exposed as a fraud. And it's this dread of discovery that really characterizes imposter syndrome. Now, it's also known as imposterism and the imposter phenomenon. It was coined or defined in the 1970s by two US female psychologists, Doctors Clance and Imes. Now, their early research really focused on women, but the more recent research indicates that both men and women suffer from imposter syndrome in equal number. So Marjorie, Luba, David, really a warm welcome again to this session this morning. I guess we all express imposter syndrome in different ways. And Marjorie, if I may start with yourself, what words do you use to describe this imposterism?
Thanks, Thomas. The words that come to mind for me are fraud, outsider, inadequate, and shame.
Shame's quite a big word there, Marjorie. I mean, can you expand on that a little?
It is a big word. It's a sense of feeling less than, and kind of standing in the shadows and hiding behind, not feeling confident to put yourself forward.
Right, okay, thank you. And Luba, what words would you use to describe imposter syndrome?
So I think the immediate words that come to mind, they also have this negative connotation of discomfort, lack of confidence, lack of the sense of belonging. But then I would also like to mention that having been through this imposter syndrome phenomena so many times in my life, I can also now unpack it and associate it with new circumstances and where I put myself out there. So there is this almost second order word of self-reinvention that I also associate with imposter syndrome.
Right, thank you. And so pleased to hear you relating it to lack of confidence as well, because you know, we've spoken to so many people that relates to, so I will be doubling back to that, Luba, thank you. David, your own expression of imposter syndrome.
Yeah, thanks Thomas, and good morning everyone, and very much resonates with Marjorie and Luba. You know, the words that come to mind are feeling inadequate, feeling not good enough. Right. I think also, Thomas, you mentioned discovery, and I kind of associated the phrase, you know, they'll catch on eventually that you're not good enough, and that's how I kind of I feel, that you know, eventually the people will realize that you're not good enough to be doing the role that you've actually been given. And it's that kind of feeling of self-doubt and nervousness, which you know, to Luba's point, actually is something you can capture and harness to continually improve and strive to prove that wrong, if you know what I mean. So there's a bit of circularity there.
Oh, David, thank you. And you know, we're going to double back and obviously talk about your own career shortly, but has anyone ever tapped you in the shoulder and said, David, you're a complete fraud?
No, they haven't, but interestingly, and we'll talk about this later, but luckily enough they haven't, Thomas, which I sense is good, but you know, we will talk about this later. One of the things that I actually didn't know, and therefore I hope today's session is very useful for people, is I didn't know imposter syndrome was a thing until about 2 years ago, when a colleague, you know, I said, gosh, I'm not sure I'm the right person for this role. Of course you are. I never feel I'm that confident. Oh, you've got imposter syndrome. What's that? And they sent me a link to a thought piece on imposter syndrome. So actually understanding it's the thing I think is been very beneficial to me, and I hope for everyone this morning.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. And we will double back to your career, of course. Now, you will remember that we did ask you to send us through your profiles, and Luba, I've got yours in front of me here now. Now, let me just read a few extracts, and thank you for sending this through. You know, you lead the global research function at Willis Towers Watson's investment business. You've worked across the London and New York offices. Your career, as Russell said, started in 1996 in Russia, where you owned your own timber business. You're currently a non-executive director of the Investor Forum. You've attended Harvard Business School, London Business School, and I see that you've also got a BA in linguistics from the Linguistic University in Belarus. Now, I'm sure the 170 attendees who've logged in this morning are going to be, delighted to hear that someone with such a sort of resume, does actually suffer from imposter syndrome. Can you tell us more, Luba? When have you had time to suffer from imposter syndrome?
No, absolutely. Well, I moved around quite a lot, and as I mentioned, the imposter syndrome for me very much associates with putting myself in new environments, new circumstances, meeting new people who know something that I don't know about. And just thinking back to my first job, so I graduated with a degree of linguistics, and by pure chance, I ended up with my first job in a bank. And I genuinely didn't know what they were talking about, although we were all speaking the same language. And it is very uncomfortable, especially so early in one's life when you really don't have the skill how to deal with this discomfort of not belonging. Mm-hmm. But then at the same time, it's also a very powerful stimulus to sort of go and improve. And this is the first thing that I did in this situation. Like, okay, I don't understand these people, so what do I do? I just go and get another degree in finance, and this is what I did. So I worked during the day and then studied in the evenings. So the positive of it is this motivation that you get.
So there could be a positive outcome from it. And recently, funnily enough, I was speaking to someone who I think will have logged in this morning, who was telling me that he knew of a fund management firm who actually go out of their way to hire people with imposter syndrome. But just to come back to that timber business, do you want to say anything about life in the timber industry at that time in your life?
It was a difficult period during my life, but I had this entrepreneurial streak in me. And when I worked for a bank, we invested in a number of timber businesses. And I thought, well, I could try and do it on my own. So I set up a small sawmill in the north of Russia. And I was exporting sawn goods, furniture components to Finland, to Germany. It was really, really difficult. And coming from finance to the timber industry, I again found myself in the situation where I had no idea what they're talking about. So I basically had to go and educate myself again. And that's, I think, almost the circle that I see repeating itself over and over again. You get yourself out there with the new idea, new circumstances, and then you just have to step up and develop. And it's painful, but there is something positive about it as well.
Oh, that's great, Luba. Thanks so much for sharing that. If I could move on to yourself, Marjorie, we were introduced a few years ago when you had just really been appointed president of the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. Now, again, I've got your the profile that you sent me, Marjorie, and if I could just read one paragraph. Past president of the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, the first IFOA president to be based outside the UK, the third female, the youngest ever, and the first person of colour. Now, when you and I met, I remember central London next to, I think it was the Houses of Parliament at the time, Marjorie. Yeah. Now, at that time, I was probably suffering from imposter syndrome just from meeting you. But I can't remember any hint of imposter syndrome from you at the time. Would you like to sort of elaborate on that? I assume that you must have felt a bit of an imposter at that time.
Yes, so there hadn't been a president that looked like me or had my background demographically. And but in reality, that sense of being an imposter was just a continuation of what I had experienced in my career to date, as an ethnic minority in corporate Britain, as a woman, and as a younger professional often. And so I've had a number of episodes of imposter syndrome across my career. And the point of difference that I would say I felt most acutely was my gender in very male-oriented environments. I experienced a number of interpersonal challenges during my presidency, which really didn't help with these feelings. But I was fortunate to have great support from the other members of the presidential team, as well as the members of council. And in the end, what I saw as being limiting differences and disadvantages turned out to be some of my greatest strengths. Being able to relate differently, having a very different perspective, speaking differently, and living in a different part of the world, I think gave me a point of view that was very different from my colleagues.
All right, okay, Marjorie, well, look, thanks for sharing that. I'm going to reflect on that and come back to you. David, we were introduced, several years ago. I think it was in Edinburgh, in Starbucks on Princess Street. David, you were leading, I think, the Manchester and Edinburgh offices at that time. I do recall that you left university in '96, joined Buck. You've been there for 24 years, risen through the ranks. I assume that there must have been times when imposter syndrome was triggered, even although you were saying earlier you didn't perhaps know what it was at the time.
Yeah, absolutely, Thomas. And I think for me, it's manifested itself in two distinct kind of experiences. One has undoubtedly been from a practicing perspective. So as a practicing actuary, often being in the room with incredibly highly qualified and very knowledgeable lawyers, accountants, people with excellent investment banking backgrounds, tax experts, and indeed other practicing actuaries. And often in a room where people clearly know an awful lot more than you do about a singular subject, and feeling like you've got no right to be in this room, or indeed, you're being asked by your client to advise on something where clearly other people in the room know an awful lot more than you. And it goes back to what we talked about in terms of driving that passion then to go and find out very quickly and become the expert that you need to be in that environment. But I think also when you meet people like that, and I find this a lot about imposter syndrome, whenever you feel like you don't belong, you seem to forget all the other things that you're very, very good at. And I must admit, at Buck, we focus an awful lot on range, the idea of knowing about an awful lot of things, perhaps only fairly shallow in terms of that knowledge, but knowing about a great many things range, rather than necessarily being a very deep subject matter expert. And I often think that when you're in that scenario where you don't know a deep detail about an individual subject, very important not to forget, well, there are an awful lot of things you are very, very knowledgeable and good at, and that range of experience is very valuable to an organization.
Ah, right, David, thank you for that. Marjorie, I did see you nodding there as David was speaking, and just coming back to this point that you made there about gender, how did you find your voice there? How did you manage that?
So I realized that if I said nothing, I wouldn't be heard. And I found often that I had something I wanted to share, or a perspective that others weren't raising. Right. And I wanted to be heard. That's what motivated me to speak out. Mm-hmm. And I think that goes for a lot of what I've done in my life, that if I tell myself that I'm not going to succeed if I don't try, then that gives me the courage to step forward.
All right, okay. And who did you speak to, if anyone, about this at the time?
Well, Thomas, I think it comes back to this point about shame, the sense of shame one feels.
Right.
I didn't tell anyone because I'm not sure I really understood what I was experiencing. And to David's point, I didn't realize that this was widespread. So at various points, I tried to analyze what I was experiencing and tried to counter it with positive motivation.
Right.
And I'd always been comfortable asking for help with work-related matters, so seeking input. But it hadn't occurred to me that I could ask for help with this as well. And so it's come full circle in a way, because as a coach, I help a lot of people to work through this and to understand their own limitations in this regard.
Thank you for that, Marjorie.
Yeah.
Luba, who did you speak to about, or who have you spoken to about your imposter syndrome across the years? So I think you might be on mute there, Luba.
Thank you. That's another phrase that I will not need.
I do want you to find your voice.
Of course. Thank you, Thomas. So I was just fascinated with Marjorie comments, because it sort of emphasizes that there are different coping strategies for different personalities, and just thinking back through various situations that I experienced the imposter syndrome. At the time, I didn't even know what it was, but it was just my intuition that I have to talk it through, my feelings. And probably initially it was more my family and friends. But then as I was progressing in my career, I realized that it really helps to talk to people who may not be involved in the situation, but can give you a bit of the perspective. And I have started building this network of mentors and friends within the firm that I work, but also outside in the industry that I work in, but also outside this industry, where I can just go and get advice and also some reminder that I have actually been quite successful, so I should really feel good about myself. And it really helps in those situations where you just feel you are completely out of your depth.
Sure. Oh, that's great. I mean, it sounds as though you've built a wonderful network of people there to share how you feel. And on the subject of feelings, David, us men aren't always the best at sharing how we feel. How have you, or did you manage to share your feelings along the way with anyone?
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. You took the words right out of my mouth. I'm listening to Luba and Marjorie, very, very jealous, because I think I tend to internalize a lot of this, and as said before, when you're in the room of people who you think are far more intelligent or far more knowledgeable than you, I tend to take a step back and actually use it as the motivation to, reflect on it, internalize it, but then go and sort it out. And to me, it was far more about using it as the catalyst to go and research and to find that out. My wife, I must admit, is a very good listener to me, and constantly says, "But David, you're doing a really good job. Keep going," and she's a fantastic support. But I think she probably absorbs it for everyone else, because I don't tend to feel the need to, the need is the wrong phrase. The ability to talk about it, and also it comes back to the point I made earlier. Not knowing this was a thing means that you didn't necessarily know you needed to figure out a network to help you organize yourself, if you know what I mean. So
that's a very valid point. Yeah, that's a very valid point. And actually, David, when you talked there about internalizing things, it reminded me of a really wonderful article. I think it was written in 2013 by Oliver Burkeman, a journalist for The Guardian, who said the problem with imposter syndrome is that we tend to compare our insides with other people's outsides. I've certainly been guilty of doing that myself over the years. I wonder if I could just press the pause button here. I know that Jane's been monitoring the questions that have been coming in the chat. Jane, I just wonder, are there any thought-provoking questions there for any of our panelists, Jane?
Yes, there are. There's been lots of questions flowing through. One of them is around the sort of male-female difference around imposter syndrome. And there was a question whether women are better at expressing this than men. Men may feel it's a sort of sign of weakness to admit to these feelings. So I'd be interested in if the panel had any views on that.
David, do you want to pick that thread? I saw you nodding vigorously there.
I think that's probably a very fair point, and actually, I think as I've and I'm sure as of everyone on this call has progressed through their careers, you start to learn to realise that actually showing a bit of vulnerability and a human touch actually is a very, very powerful way of leading by example, if you know what I mean. So I know we'll potentially touch on this later on, but in the right measure and in the right way, I think it is very important not to just internalize this so much because no one can ever see a sign of weakness. I think actually showing an element of vulnerability and that we're all human in the right way is very important. But I do think it's clearly a journey that we all go on, and perhaps at the start of careers and the start of professional roles, it doesn't feel the right thing to do. So I think actually it comes with experience and kind of life experience, Thomas, that you might be more able to slightly put down the barriers, so to speak.
Right, David, thank you. And Marjorie, you were also nodding, and obviously you touched on this gender issue previously. Do you think that perhaps those men that you thought had a sort of superiority complex at the time, perhaps maybe were also suffering from imposter syndrome themselves?
Quite possibly, actually. And I think there is a sense that women tend to express it more. But I think there's also a little bit of a structural context to this, in that certainly the environments that I've worked in the past have been predominantly male. Right. And therefore the women feel like the outsiders. And I think that contributes a little bit to this sense of, oh, am I good enough to be here? But that said, from what I've read, imposter syndrome is something experienced by both men and women. And in fact, if you're sitting in a room, in a meeting, chances are everyone around the table is having some kind of imposter thought. Yes. And you probably think it's just you, and therefore you're the lesser one, but that's not necessarily the case.
Indeed. And you've reminded me here that, this isn't what we're not talking about here. It's not a recognized psychiatric condition. This is a phenomenon or experience which seemingly 70% of people do suffer from at some or another time in their life or work. And I wonder if that's an appropriate segue to maybe pass to Russell here. I see that we've got a critical mass of over 170 participants. This might be a good time to introduce and launch the poll. Russell, if I could hand that over to yourself.
Sure. So we're going to ask a question. To what extent do you feel that you suffer from imposter syndrome? And the poll will ask you, the audience, to rate it from 0 to 5. And it'll be anonymized, but we'll just be showing the aggregate figures. So I'm just going to launch the poll now, and it should be appearing on people's screens very shortly. So about half have voted. Okay. I'm just going to share the results now. And if you can see the results, the most frequent score is 4. So many people are exhibiting, feel that they exhibit or suffer from imposter syndrome quite a bit. And the 1% of people felt that they don't suffer at all from imposter syndrome. But there's a definite significant number of people who feel that they do, Thomas.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, the results here, Russell, are really really 99% of the population here are saying that they do suffer or have suffered from imposter syndrome versus I think some of the research showing 70%. Thanks for that, Russell. I wonder if we could double back, Luba, to yourself now on this subject of confidence. Obviously, we're seeing there that 99% of our attendees are suffering from imposter syndrome, presumably at times a lack of confidence, although not always linked to confidence. How have you managed to maintain your confidence in the face of this imposterism?
Thank you, Thomas. So when I look back at my life and 25 years of the professional career that I have built, I definitely see the dynamics there that I learn how to deal with it much better, and I have more data points how I lived through and managed to cope with, and this really helps with confidence. So I still find myself in situations that are completely new and where I feel I don't belong, but then I have this 25 years of doing this to refer back to. And I think there were a couple of questions there on the chat about the coping strategies. And for me to get to this confidence, it really helps to think back about the positive experiences and also to the points of vulnerability where I was, where I didn't feel great, where I did feel like an imposter. So I think confidence is incredibly important for leaders. Mm-hmm. People whom you lead, they want to see someone who can give them the sense of direction, whom they can trust. And based on my experience, the good thing is that you can build it over time.
And Luba, you talked earlier about this support network that you've gathered. Are you drawn to people who sort of exude that confidence, or what would be the qualities of the people that you would be drawn to share your feelings of imposter syndrome?
It's an interesting question because, at the moment we talk so much about the need for diversity in investment decisions and business decisions. And, it was half conscious, half subconscious. But when I think about my network from this perspective, it's really very diverse. So I do have people who are very confident to a degree of almost not being self-aware. But then there are also people who would probably, where I feel the confident one. And I think it's quite important to have this diversity of perspective in your personal decisions as well, when you can rely on your network.
Very good, thank you. And David, you mentioned vulnerability earlier, showing maybe appropriate degrees of vulnerability. But what impact do you think showing that vulnerability has in others, and perhaps also what impact has that had in you seeing others admitting their vulnerability?
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. I think actually to that point, I think using imposter syndrome can be a great regulator in your own kind of personal life and how you focus on tasks. I mean, I think using that vulnerability ensures that you don't appear overconfident, right. You don't appear arrogant. So the balance on one hand is so you don't go so over the top that actually you appear rude or overconfident or overdriven that people don't buy into it. But equally, don't regulate the other way with imposter syndrome so that you lose drive or positivity or focus. And I think it's using that kind of bit in the middle that allows people to see your vulnerability and human, but you still are a driven, focused leader to make things happen. And I think that using imposter syndrome as a regulator actually makes you a more rounded leader that people buy into and want to work together with as a team.
All right, David, that's well articulated. And you, Marjorie, in terms of that tug of war between confidence and vulnerability, how have you balanced that over the years?
So you tell yourself that you're expected to be a pillar and you're unfazed by whatever comes your way as a leader, and people see you wearing your iron armor and they can't imagine you being anything other than what they see.
Right.
But we're all human, and we all have times where we're not feeling our most confident or feeling our best. And I think what allows that to emerge is being in a safe environment. So as leaders, there's a responsibility to create those sorts of environment where people can share when they're not operating at their best, and allow the reality to emerge that we are human and imperfect, and therefore acceptable. So I think that there is a need to be strong and to be confident and to appear as if you're giving comfort to others in that sense, but to allow the human side of you to emerge, and that allows you to engage, I think, better with people as well.
Right, okay, thank you.
Thomas, and can I just, this question of the balance between vulnerability and confidence, because it was relatively recent this year in March, April, where I found that the need to find this balance for me as a leader was particularly acute when it was clear as we were going into this crisis that you had to show your vulnerability, that it was the situation that no one had experienced before. But then at the same time, it was clear that at this particular moment, people were looking for more confidence and more direction. And for me, it was quite a big lesson in how to balance these two, and how difficult it could be, especially in the extreme conditions.
And how did you do that yourself then, Luba?
Well, it definitely helped that there was the experience, 25 years of thinking about it. But even with all this experience, there were definitely some moments where I continued learning, and there were situations where I thought, like, God, I should have done it differently. So it's again this situation where, like, am I being too vulnerable? Am I being too confident? You just learn by doing it and accumulating this experience.
Right, thank you. Yeah, so we're going to come back in a moment to your tips and tricks for managing imposter syndrome that we can share with our attendees this morning. Just to check in with Jane again. Jane, do you have another thought-provoking question or two for us there?
There have been a few questions, yes, around how you can help other people who are suffering from imposter syndrome. Is it easy to spot, and what can you do to help other people, particularly if they're going through career changes, which is often when there's a trigger of imposter syndrome? Of course.
And Jane, you've written an article, obviously, on the Leading Figures website that I did notice one line that, it's so easy to have one failure and then start, with that negative self-talk and say, well, so your thought process goes from I have failed to I am a complete failure. To that point, Marjorie, you talked earlier about, your experiences of being president of the IFOA for the first time, the youngest, etc. Do you want to share some thoughts on how you got through that and how others might recognize it in themselves and how they might begin to manage it or share it with others?
Thanks, Thomas. So I would say, for me, what I learned was a lot of it resides internally.
Right.
And there are some external triggers, which I realized eventually were often others' insecurities being reflected onto me. And I had to learn how not to interact with that.
Yes.
And that the majority of the shortcomings or the feelings that I was experiencing came from inside. And the way that I managed it was to give myself affirmations of things that I knew to be true, and to repeat those to myself. And I find them very effective in taking away the negative emotions. Also, eventually being able to talk about it, I think, was extremely helpful. So using support systems. And then I think there's an important lesson for me in differentiating between fact and feelings. So when you do interact with this external input, can you filter what is true feedback and what are emotions? And that often means you're dealing with a lot less than you would otherwise.
All right, the distinction between fact and feelings, that's very insightful, Marjorie, thanks. And Luba, to Jane's question there, you know, you've had various career changes, you've alluded to those. Did you find that, you know, imposter syndrome struck at those points of change? But obviously over the years it sounds as though you've become used to that, you've drawn on the past to inform how you move forward in the present and the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the point of change is where the imposter syndrome emerges with full force. And definitely, the more of these situations you go through, the better equipped you become, the quicker you can handle it. And then also an interesting perspective there was this question about helping others. I definitely found that with time, I became more capable of identifying it in others and also helping others. But interestingly enough, working with others on this helped me to gain even additional perspective. So at this point, you definitely enrich your own ability when you see how different people cope with it in different ways.
How did you spot those who have it, or how do you spot those who have it, Luba? What are the signs?
Well, it's something is not right. Like in the easiest situation when it is on the surface, it's self-doubt, the lack of confidence, but these are easy ones. The difficult and more challenging ones, and actually I would probably say that I would encounter more of those where something is just not working, and then you start unpacking it, why the results are not there, why the person is not delivering to what you see as a potential, and then you start working with them to get to the bottom of it, which is actually when you can help people is incredibly rewarding, and as I said, enriches your own experience and ability to deal with it.
That's very insightful too, that in helping others, you've almost helped to reconcile it for yourself. Yeah, very good. David, your own insights, advice to those you know, logged in here this morning on how to manage their imposter syndrome?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, Thomas, and actually you've been a great personal help to me on precisely this. There will be times when you feel like you are vulnerable, like you don't belong, like you aren't doing a good enough job. And I think always being able to reflect back on, you are hardworking, you are professional, you are honest. You know, I think just having those the kind of the moral compass pointing in the right direction. I always say, I've got photos over there of my children, being able to look at my children's photo and say, you know, I'm always doing the right thing. Not mentioning it because Marjorie's on the call, but last time we spoke about the actuary's code and things like that, not just as how to be an actuary, but actually just what the moral compass for how to perform work is very important. So constantly reminding yourself that even if something has gone wrong, or you're dealing with a difficult task or a task where you may feel that you've not been at the point of where you should be, and therefore you feel like an imposter, there are so many good things that you do, and that your moral compass is pointing in the right direction. So I think that would be my advice to people feeling like that. I think there is a reflection though for leaders as well on how to help the people that they lead and manage. That being able to ask people, you know, how are you feeling, and to try and draw out kind of vulnerabilities from people is probably a really, really important part of leadership. And I think we all remember those leaders where are so overconfident and arrogant that we almost just report what we think they need to hear and put the phone down and stop the meeting and say see you soon, because that's what they want to hear, relative to the leader who will really sit you down, open up, share vulnerabilities, and allow that to be the same. So I think you know, as well as tips for people who will be feeling that way, I think tips for people as leaders to help draw that out is really important.
Oh, that's a great point, David, from both sides of the imposter syndrome fence. You've reminded me there too that of the two psychologists who defined imposter syndrome, Dr. Clance has actually developed the Clance Imposter Syndrome Scale or Test. Now you can actually go in and have a look at that on her website, which is paulineroseclance.com. Just as it sounds, Clance is spelled C-L-A-N-C-E. That's paulineroseclance.com for the Clance Imposter Syndrome Scale or Test. I see that she's also written a book called The Imposter Phenomenon, Overcoming the Fear That Haunts Your Success. But there is a wealth, as we all know, of information on imposter syndrome online and available in sort of bookstores, etc. A final question: do you think we grow out of imposter syndrome or grow into it, Marjorie?
I think we grow into it and then eventually grow out of it. I don't think children are born hesitant and unconfident. We start to compare ourselves and we start to feel as if we lack something, and over time convince ourselves that we are not as good as other people. But I think that that is something that you can develop ways to counter and therefore grow out of the habit of falling into that mindset.
Right, Marjorie, thank you. Luba, do you think we start off fearless and become fearful and then go back to fearless? What do you think?
Definitely grow into it and learn how to cope with it. And I think there was a question about whether it ever disappears. I do think if the imposter syndrome has disappeared, then maybe you are too much in your comfort zone and haven't experienced new and haven't stretched yourself into something that you could still potentially do. So I do think that there is positive force for good in the imposter syndrome. So I personally wouldn't want it to completely disappear from my life despite all the discomfort.
Well, that is a wonderful line to end on, Luba. Thanks ever so much. Thank you to yourself, to Marjorie, to David. I'm going to hand over to Jane now to close off the session. Thanks again.
Thank you.
I apologise that my phone is ringing in the background and I can't do anything about it. So if you could all ignore that as I'm trying to. I'd like to thank the panel for just a fantastic session this morning. Your willingness to share your personal stories is really helpful to certainly have been helpful to me and is helpful to others. And I'd also like to thank all the attendees for your wonderful questions. And I'm sorry that we haven't been able to get to them all, but I think there are some themes in those questions that perhaps we could respond to after the seminar. And I'd like to thank Thomas for leading us through the panel session. I hope you've all found it useful. We'd love to hear your feedback, and we will be planning our next seminar shortly. So thank you very much, everybody.